Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation at CPR today. Let me, on behalf of all of us, extend a warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Ronak Minali, who is a research fellow at the Center for Social Change based at in Kathmandu. I also am grateful to Ronak for accepting our invitation to speak, also because, primarily because when I met him in Kathmandu or at a conference last month, he mentioned that he's going to be in Delhi for a personal visit, for a brief personal visit, and I saw this as an opportunity to host him at CPR, to listen to him and his very interesting work that he's doing. And I'm very grateful to you, Ronak, for obliging and for accommodating our request to speak here. I'd also like to congratulate him for his new book, which is just out, and which is on Nepal's peace process. It's been brought out by Routledge, and in South Asia edition is still awaited eagerly, or I may say impatiently.
Impatiently is the right word.
I think this book and the theme that he and his co-author Prakash Bhattarai deal with comes at a timing. It couldn't have been better timed because, as we all know, Nepal is at a very is going through considerable Nepali politics is going through considerable churn, and it is also reminds me of what the eminent scholar and former Nepali ambassador to India, Professor Lokraj Baral, called, referring to the Nepali politics as, quote unquote, full of absurdities. Absurdities, I suppose, are a running theme across South Asian politics, and it's very, I would say, characterizes South Asian politics, and it reminds me of what the veteran journalist Zafar Iqbal said in the 1990s about South Asian politics being, quote unquote, the theater of the absurd. So may I request you, Ronak, to help us understand what is at play here and to help us understand the cast of characters in this theater. Thank you.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming here today. I'd also like to thank everyone who've joined us virtually online to listen to this. I'd also like to extend a thank you to Dr. Kur for inviting me here and for chairing this talk. Hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion towards the end. But yeah, absurd is the right way, as we will see from my presentation. A lot of absurdities, a lot of absurd characters, and it is confusing, not because I'm failing to explain these things to you. It is confusing by nature, Nepal's alignment and Nepal's, let's say, idiosyncrasies. So yeah, if we could pull the slides up, then I could begin. So yes, for this presentation, we'll be looking at how Nepal's foreign policy of hedging, has it been effective? Has it been, is it a sustainable foreign policy? And to look at this, we need to look at a few questions in general. First, we need to understand what hedging is. And this is a bit complicated because it is a relatively new theory in international relations. And then we'll be talking about what Nepal is hedging against. We'll understand hedging as a risk mitigation strategy. So what is this risk that Nepal is hedging against? Finally, through foreign policy examples, we'll look at how Nepal is hedging. And finally, probably the most important aspect is this effective and is this a sustainable foreign policy option? So first, we'll go through a very basic international relations 101. To understand hedging, we first need to understand balancing and bandwagoning. And from then we can understand hedging. So in a regional system, for example, you have state A, state B. State B is more powerful because of material capabilities, population, stronger military, stronger economy. For these reasons, state A might have some insecurities regarding this. State B might threaten state A, and for this reason, they might choose to balance state B. And how can state A do this? Well, they can improve their own material capabilities, they can develop their own economy, and therefore we call this internal balancing. However, if they do not have the capability to do so, they might choose to align with another power, another state, and therefore we call this external balancing. If this is not an option in a regional environment, we might have a situation where state A faces, we might have a situation where state A faces a dilemma. It does not have a suitable partner for an alliance, so we might see it align with the threat. We call this bandwagoning. And this is not entirely a favorable foreign policy option because it could result in erosion of autonomy for certain countries, but it could possibly be the best case scenario for these countries. And so now we understand balancing and bandwagoning, we can come towards hedging. At the end of the Cold War, during the rise of China, balancing and bandwagoning were not enough to explain the state behavior of several states, particularly in Southeast Asia. So we'll look at China, Malaysia, and the US and their interactions. So Malaysia at this time wanted to reap the benefits of China's economic rise, and therefore it was cooperating very closely with China in terms of its economy. But at the same time, China carried a risk because of several maritime territorial disputes, and therefore Malaysia chose to hedge and sort of balance this relationship with a security cooperation with the United States. And this was through either joint military drills or buying weapons from the USA or intelligence sharing. And this is not unique to Malaysia. This was done by several Southeast Asian nations. And if we just look at some facts and figures, for example, we can see that in the year 2000, before China rose exponentially, you can see China only accounted for 4%, around 4% of the import partner share for Malaysia, whereas in 2010, this had increased to about 12.5. So as you can see, this is a result of close economic cooperation with China and Malaysia. But at the same time, as we can see on the left, that's the South China Sea and China's 9-dash claim in the South China Sea. This obviously intersects the claim of several other countries, such as Philippines, Vietnam, but in this case, Malaysia as well. So Malaysia saw this as a risk, and therefore they had to, at the same time, while they're cooperating with China economically, they had to cooperate with a different power to sort of balance their relationship. And therefore, they chose to align with the USA, at least in terms of security. But the problem with hedging is because it's such a new topic and because it's essentially a contested concept, we have a situation where scholars can't really agree on which countries are hedging and which countries aren't. So these are some of the most influential works on hedging. And as you can see, only Singapore really maintains a consensus on whether it is hedging or not. You could argue Philippines to an extent. Also, there is an agreement on whether it's hedging or not. But in most countries, the scholars can't decide on whether they're hedging or not. So there's not a consensus on everything. So this means that we sort of need a framework to decide whether a country is hedging or not. So I will be using for my study a framework by Jürgen Hack. He's a professor at the London School of Economics. And basically, he says that there are 3 indicators to suggest whether a nation is hedging or not. So the first indicator is that hedging is a response to a risk. And this is a very important but confusing distinction because balancing and bandwagoning are seen as responses to threat and not a risk. And there is a difference. It can seem a bit confusing, but threat is basically involves capability and intent. Is this country capable of threatening us? Does it have intent to threaten us? So if we just use China for an example, during this period, China certainly had the intent to threaten this area because it saw this area as its maritime territory. But at this point in time, they did not have the capability to do so because their material capability, at least in the 2000s, was not as strong as it is now. And therefore, we can say that China was a risk then. Whereas now China, the naval power is a lot stronger, their economy is a lot stronger, so they can effectively challenge the US in this region. So now we can constitute, now a lot of these countries see China as a threat in the region and not a risk. So we can argue that So we can say that first indicator is that hedging is a response to a risk and not a threat. The second is a limited pursuit of enhancement. So the country that is hedging sort of pursues enhancement, but to a limited extent. So Jürgen Hack mainly talks about this in the military realm. Basically, a country might buy a lot of weapons from other countries, might cooperate with other countries, but also improve by modernizing their military. But this has to be to a limited extent, because if it does this to a very, let's say, a very high extent, it could be seen as a balancing maneuver, not a hedging maneuver. And I want to bring this to the economic realm because Nepal does not face any security risk from its neighbors. It's more economic risks, as we'll get into it in a bit. And therefore, we will bring this logic to the economic realm as well. Nepal is looking to diversify its trade routes so it is not completely dependent upon a single country. And finally, indicator 3 is alignment and ambiguity. So basically, the country that is hedging does not profess its alignment to a certain country. It is very ambiguous whether this is intentional or not, because it does not want to completely align with one country. It wants to keep it ambiguous so it can sort of choose which one to align with in case the risk materializes. So moving on from this, what is Nepal actually hedging against? Well, Nepal sees its position as very vulnerable, being a landlocked nation between between India and China. To the north, with China, the border is quite difficult. It's quite perilous. It has the tallest mountains in the world, whereas the border with India is generally quite permissive. In the south, it's a pretty plain border. In the west and east, it's pretty hilly, but it is not mountainous compared to the border with China. And because of this, because of these arrangements, Nepal has had extensive historical, religious, cultural ties with India. My own family, I believe, about 500 years ago, migrated from Uttarakhand into Nepal. At least that's what the oral ancestors tell us. We're not exactly, there's no source for that, so don't quote me on it. But yeah, also religious reasons as well. Buddhism and Hinduism obviously has proliferated across the border. But in Nepal, the most important, at least this moment, is the economic ties between India and Nepal. Nepal is very, very dependent upon India for trade, not just products from India, but also third country trade, because Kolkata is I believe, the closest geographical port to Nepal, so it relies a lot on that for third country trade. And this vulnerability has been exposed in the past. So in 1989, there was a blockade where 21 of the 22 transit points between Nepal and India were blockaded, and therefore it resulted in an economic loss, a massive economic loss in Nepal. So the growth rate in 1989 fell from 1.7 to 1.5%. And even in 2015, just after the earthquake, there was an unofficial blockade along the border, and the economy slowed down to about 0.2%. So clearly, Nepal's vulnerabilities lie in their dependence upon India, and the government recognizes this and wants to move away from this. And this is the risk, that materializes. If something were to happen to India's economy, it will have residual effects on Nepal. This doesn't necessarily have to be a blockade. It could be some other domestic reasons or international reasons where India's economy is affected, and therefore it has a domino effect on Nepal's economy. And although it's not relevant, regime survival is also a cause for hedging. So specifically, if we look in the 1960s under King Tribhuvan in Nepal, he often tried to play the China card to gain concessions out of India, and also to stop India's support for the democratic forces in Nepal. And of course, Nepali Congress Party and Indian National Congress at that point had a lot of linkages, and King Tribhuvan was very adept at playing the China card to try and curb Indian influence in Nepal. So now that we know what the risk Nepal is hedging against, we'll look at the indicators we mentioned earlier to decide if Nepal is actually hedging or not. So the first indicator is that this is a risk and not a threat. So as I mentioned earlier, risk depends on capability and intent. Certainly, because Nepal is so dependent upon India, there is a capability that India poses a threat. But I believe that there is no intent because it doesn't, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily have to be a blockade, an active policy, perhaps by the Indian government in a way to subvert sorry, in a way to influence Nepal, it doesn't have to be something as drastic as that. It could just be some domestic changes or domestic problems in India, which might have an effect on Nepal. Or obviously, because we're so dependent upon India, this would have eventually an effect on Nepali economy as well. And also, Nepal has downplayed threats from India in the past. Oli and Prachanda, KP Oli and Prachanda, who are seen as more anti-Indian forces in Nepal and pro-Chinese forces, they've often used this rhetoric to get into power. But once they've got into power, they very much play the role of India down and even look towards India for help through various reasons. Also, India is part of the Indo-Pacific strategy of USA, and it subscribes to a lot of rules-based orders, such as freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, and also respecting state sovereignty. India is also looking for a seat in the UN Security Council, so it obviously undermined their candidacy to sort of threaten a neighbor, especially one that it has enjoyed cordial relationships with. So it's seen more as a risk than a threat. And also, India realizes that India sort of sees China as encircling its region at the moment, and therefore it wouldn't make sense to threaten neighbors and sort of push them towards China even more. So that's indicator one. If we look at indicator two, I mentioned limited pursuit of enhancement. So even though the military is not exactly relevant to the case of Nepal, because this is not a military risk, it is more of an economic risk. We have been doing some diversification in that as well. So we have a joint drills with India, the Surya Kiran exercises that just finished about 4 days ago. And we also have the Sagarmatha Friendship Treaty, friendship joint drills with China, which finished in September 2024, and that takes place every 2 years as well. We've also been purchasing weapons from the USA and South Korea in the past, so sort of trying to diversify our relationships there. But the main thing was after the 2015 blockade and the 1989 blockade, it was the lack of fuel. It was mainly a fuel shortage that sort of drove the economy down. And because of this, Nepal signed oil deals with China in the post-2015 era, particularly under Oli and Prachanda. Also, the Belts and Road Initiative, this was progressed a lot after the 2015 blockade. And also, China allowed Nepal to use its ports for third country trade, its dry ports and seaports, to allow Nepal to diversify its relations with other countries and sort of trade with other countries, so it's not entirely dependent upon India. And also recently, Nepal has signed a buffalo meat export treaty, which actually is $1.5 billion worth. So it is quite significant and worth a mention. Also, Nepal is actually conducting joint oil exploration with China as we speak. The results are unknown so far as they've just started. So maybe that will sort of work out well for Nepal as well. And finally, Nepal has been trying to conduct its own initiatives, such as the Bhairava, Pokhara, and Nijgat airports. So these are international airports that it hopes would allow Nepal to directly bring in cargo and tourists from other areas, and therefore sort of bypass the need for a neighbor and transit port anyway. So yeah, so these are some ways that Nepal has been sort of trying to improve their economic enhancement. And the last one is the ambiguous alignment signals. And this is probably the most confusing one of them all. Nepal, since democracy was introduced, particularly federal democracy in 2008, we've had a lot of instability and a lot of different leaders, but these three have remained consistently at the top. So the first is KP Oli. He's seen mostly to be anti-Indian and pro-China, and this was one of the ways he gained power in the first place after the 2015 blockade. Even now, he sometimes uses anti-India rhetoric to sort of gain popularity. So recently he said Ayodhya was not in India, it was in Nepal. So he does things like this, gimmicky things to sort of try and gain some populist sentiment. But despite this, KP Oli still looked towards India for help during the constitutional crisis in 2020. He was desperately seeking to stay in power, so he sent his foreign minister, Pradeep Gewali, to India multiple times within a short amount of time to sort of try and get support for himself to stay in power. Also, he supported the Millennium the Million Corporation Compact, which is a US-backed infrastructure grant, which is seen by China as an anti-Chinese maneuver by the US, a direct competition with the BRI. But KP Oli has supported this. Prachanda, similarly as KP Oli, was seen as anti-China and probably is still seen as, seen as anti-India and more pro-China. Particularly during his rebel days, the Maoist Party of Nepal in the manifesto before launching their civil war stated that they wanted to curb Indian influence in the region. They wanted to renegotiate several of the water treaties with India. So he was seen as very much anti-Indian. Even when he got into power in politics, he decided to visit China before he visited India, which broke a tradition of Nepalese prime ministers visiting India first. But then he also looked towards India for help when he tried to oust KP Oli from power. And recently, in his last visit to India, he avoided a lot of contentious topics with India to try and gain favor from them, to try and sort of improve relationship with them. So even Prachanda, who's seen as an anti-India force, is quite ambiguous in his alignment into who he actually prefers. And also he has been in a coalition with Sherbal Deuba, who's the last individual to look at, who is seen as a more pro-Indian and pro-Western ally. But even his alignment is not exactly known because he has endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative. His wife, Arzu Rana Deuba, who's currently the foreign minister, actually went to China to sign the BRI cooperation framework recently, about 2 or 3 months ago. And Deuba is in a coalition with KP Oli, who's seen as pro-China, and therefore we have a lot of issues where a lot of the alignments are pretty capricious. They're pretty prone to change depending on what opportunities arise. And because of instability as well, the alignment is always changing. So because of this, we have a Nepal where I believe unintentionally we are following an ambiguous alignment because these politicians seem to change their alignment depending on what benefits them most and what would help their regime survival. So with hedging as a risk mitigation strategy and all these initiatives that Nepal has taken, we would expect to see that we've lessened our dependence on India in the last, let's say, 10 years. After 2015, especially after the blockade, that's when Nepal started to pursue even more closer relations with China. So it's been about 10 years. But let's see, if we see the data, we can sort of scrutinize what has happened if we have actually lessened our dependence on India. So in 2013, 2014, India made about 65% of both import and export share for Nepal, whereas China's one is significantly lower, 3.11% export share and around 12.4% import share. So India we were very dependent upon India, and I don't think this even accounts for third country trade that comes through India in the first place. So you'd think after all these risk mitigation strategies, we would have lessened our dependence on India. And I guess that is slightly true. We are importing about 3% less from India and importing 6% more from China. But as you can see, India still has a giant share in Nepal's economy. And if we were to imagine another blockade would materialize, we would still be in the same situation as before, where most of our trade with the international world and with India would stop. But if we were to scrutinize the data even more, obviously we saw that there was a lot of fuel shortages, and fuel was the main reason for why Nepal struggled during the blockade. If we scrutinize the data even, we can see this is from the year 2019 and 2020. Sadly, the government hasn't released specific data like this since then, and I do understand COVID might have affected this, but I'm pretty sure the trends will be similar. So in 2019, 2020, we imported about 1.5 million kiloliters of diesel from India, whereas outside of India, there was none. There was only marginal amounts of light diesel from Japan. Gas, we had about 400 million kilograms from India, whereas from everywhere else, we only had 6 kilograms from China. And then finally, petrol, 500,000 kiloliters from India, and once again, none from any other countries. So we can see that we are still very dependent upon India for important things such as fuel, but generally just in trade, we are very much dependent upon India. So why has this failed? Since we took all those initiatives, why haven't they materialized? Why hasn't Nepal significantly lessened its dependence on India? There's a few reasons for that. Trade with and through China is very, very fraught with difficulties. That is the road to Rosawagadi, one of the only two border points with China where trade actually comes through. As you can see, it is not entirely conducive to trade, and that's during a good time. If you go during monsoon, that road probably doesn't exist. It's probably covered by rocks and landslides. And that has stopped trade in the past with China. And China is most country's biggest exporter and is the world's biggest exporter. And this is not exactly conducive to trade with such a big country. Also, the oil deal with China has not progressed, and bringing oil through China is actually more expensive than Indian oil, and this has dissuaded Nepal to actually follow this. So for oil, a lot of China's oil is imported from third countries, and a lot of them have to travel a long way from seaports to reach Nepal, whereas coming through India, coming through Kolkata, it's much, much, much easier. The roads are way easier to navigate. The distance is shorter, so it actually becomes cheaper to bring oil from India than through China. And also, recently, Nepal has distanced itself from this oil. It has not pursued it further and has actually looked towards India for bringing new oil in. So we actually built two new pipelines in 2024, one in Chitwan and one in Zappa. So in fact, instead of moving away from fuel dependence on India, we seem to be importing even more fuel from India. Also, minimum dialogue with China. As I mentioned earlier, the deal is one of the only significant deals to happen in recent years. And there's also high import standard for Nepali goods. So if you're an exporter in Nepal wanting to export goods to China, they've actually set a quite high barrier of entry. So if you were to export agricultural produce, for example, China require things such as a proof of origin, which makes it very hard for local farmers and exporters to actually send it to China. And also China, obviously being a massive manufacturing base, is very hard for Nepali goods to actually compete with Chinese goods. And therefore, we're not actually exporting anything to China or, to be fair, anywhere else in the world. And yeah, diplomatic efforts outside of outside of India, China has also been minimal and mostly related to foreign aid and not actually trade, and not actually trying to improve Nepal's own domestic market and improving our manufacturing base and making sure our products are actually marketable and competitive at the global stage. And because of this, we're not exporting many things, leading to a huge foreign deficit, which obviously leads to other problems. This was exposed during COVID when we had very, very little foreign currency, and the import of luxury items was stopped at that time. So in fact, we didn't get any Indian things such as kurkure and lays. We weren't able to have any at that time. So that obviously shows the fact that the trade deficit that Nepal currently is sustaining is not very good and very vulnerable. Other reasons for failure. So the airports I mentioned earlier, Bhairav and Pokhara, when I originally conducted this research, they actually hadn't been completed yet. Now they've been complete and functional for a couple of years, but they're not in regular use at all, which is despite the fact that Nepal's main airport, Tribhuvan International Airport, is running on limited hours at the moment. It's being renovated, so it's only running for about 8-10 hours a day instead of running 24 hours. And this would have provided the perfect opportunity for Bhairawa and Pokhara airports to bring international flights, but they're just not doing so at the moment. In fact, Pokhara airport, I believe, had only 4 international flights in the last year, and 2 of them were chartered planes from China. Bhairawa has a few more, but even these are very inconsistent. I believe the Fly Dubai and a few other airlines were operating before, but for the last few months, there haven't been any international flights to Bhairawa either. The Nijgat project, which was meant to be the biggest airport in South Asia and the 4th biggest in the world, that was halted by the Supreme Court of Nepal because due to feasibility reasons, it would have led to a lot of deforestation of natural resources, a lot of deforestation and and eventually this was stopped by the Supreme Court. The BRI projects were also at a standstill, mainly due to Nepal not pursuing it enough and also because of funding issues. This was until recently. Nepal, end of last year, went to sign the BRI cooperation framework with China. And here, even then, the issue of funding was kind of stopping it from progressing. Nepal wanted grants in order to complete these projects, whereas China wanted to provide loans. And there was a lot of negotiation and debate over how to actually continue with this. Eventually, the wording they settled was for aid assistance funding, which even the people that negotiated are not entirely sure what that means. But roughly, I think they meant that they were going to get loans that were competitive with IMF and World Bank rates, interest rates. But even within that, there is some sort of debate within the different parties about what aid assistance financing actually means. One of the major BRI projects is the Trans-Himalayan Railway. So that is a train from Tibet in China to Nepal. And this has faced several roadblocks, mainly being funding, but also environmental impact that could have, building such a train line through very vulnerable ecological areas. And also the other projects that are part of the BRI, a lot of them will not actually deliver economic returns to Nepal. So I'll use three of them in particular, which just so happen to be situated within the constituencies of KP Oli and Sherbada Deuba. So one of them is a city hall in Amargadi, which is within Sherbada Deuba and Arzuranu Deuba's constituency. And then there is a sports complex in Zappa, and then a friendship park, China and Nepal Friendship Park in Zappa. So obviously these are not likely to lead to economic returns for Nepal. There are some transmission line and connectivity projects which are likely to be more fruitful, but overall, they're still far from being complete, and without much progress on how to fund this, they are looking like they will be at a standstill for a bit longer as well. Now, finally, we'll look at whether this hedging strategy is actually sustainable. So Nicholas Ross Smith uses the example of Ukraine trying to hedge in a very unfavorable environmental security environment. And so he poses three reasons why hedging should not be undertaken. So one is anarchy. So there might be a region where there is no security structure. So in South Asia, we have very limited multilateralism. SARC is not very effective at multilateralism. It functions on a very limited mandate without much political will. BIMSTEC, another organization, does not include some regional partners, and therefore is not, again, a very strong multilateral organization compared to something such as the ASEAN or EU. Bipolarity is another reason why nations shouldn't pursue hedging. So when there are two powers within a certain regional environment, especially ones that are hostile towards each other, this leads to an alignment of a smaller nation becoming increasingly zero-sum. So the alignment of a small country becomes very important for the bigger countries, and therefore they're likely to take stronger approaches to trying to get this alignment. And of course, with South Asia, you have the Sino-Indian rivalry, but we also have the Pakistan-Indian rivalry, and now with increasing US involvement in the area, we have Sino-US rivalry here as well. And this has a lot of impact on smaller nations such as Nepal, who are trying to be ambiguous. And it is not entirely wise to do this in a region where a lot of these big countries are trying to gain your alignment. Now, what are the consequences of this? So because now Nepal's alignment has become more zero-sum, we are likely to see India and China play a carrot and stick model where they're a bit more aggressive towards gaining Nepal's alignment. So how have we seen this? So with China, we're directly involved in the formation of the Unified Communist Party of Nepal. So this is when China was instrumental in putting together the Communist Party of Nepal under the Maoists and the Communist Party of Nepal under the Marxist-Leninists. So that is KP Oli and Prachanda's party. So China was directly involved in putting them together. And when they eventually split due to ideological reasons, China once again tried to put them together. And when they were together, when they fought the 2017 elections together, they won a huge majority. So this obviously has a foreign power influencing Nepali politics in this way. If India were to do it, this would be all over the headlines in Nepal. So it was quite surprising that this didn't gain much traction in Nepal at the time. And also, when the two parties were together, there was actually workshops on training the political officials of these parties in Xi Jinping thought. Also, China were heavily lobbying against the MCC by the US, which they said was anti-China, despite the fact it was a really beneficial, it is a really beneficial infrastructure project to Nepal. And finally, China recently, with the monsoon floodings this year, China is giving direct aid to political parties in order to combat destruction due to flooding. And this has never been done before in Nepal, which a certain country was providing direct aid to political parties, not through an official channel, but to political parties. And this caused quite a lot of stir and controversy within Nepal. And finally, through India, India has said that they're not going to buy hydropower project from any hydroelectricity, from any hydropower project with Chinese involvement. We've also seen a stricter application of the Bureau of Indian Standards, which basically means that any Nepali exports with Chinese components have to reach a certain standard. And this is quite a recent thing, so there hasn't been any data on it, but a lot of exporters have said that their exports to India have dropped significantly. And recently, because Oli went to China first before India when he was elected and the BRI framework was signed, he still has not received an invitation from India to visit. And he's even sent the foreign minister to try and get an invitation, but he has not got one yet. So we'll see if that changes in the next few weeks. But yeah, so as we've seen, both because Nepal's alignment has become so zero-sum and so important to these countries, they've taken a more drastic and sort of aggressive measure to try and get Nepal on their side. And finally, if we go back to the start, we talked about how the Southeast Asian nations were sort of hedging during the 2000s because they wanted to get benefits of a growing economy, at the same time protect themselves against a certain risk through cooperation with the US. But now, as you can see, China has become more of a threat in the region. So now Southeast Asian nations, in this example, Vietnam, has actually pursued very close relations with the US. And that is despite the historical baggage between the US and Vietnam. And this is mainly because Vietnam now sees China as a massive threat in the South China Sea. That is their perception. So now they've looking to forge closer relations with the US and sort of try and balance them, because now China is a threat, as I mentioned earlier. Hedging is a risk response, whereas balancing and bandwagon response is a threat. And because Vietnam sees China as a threat in the region, they are balancing them with the USA. So just to summarize, hedging is a risk mitigation strategy. So Nepal tried to lessen its dependence on India by hedging mainly with China, the risk being drastic effects on the economy due to the dependence on India. The hedge was not very effective. Nepal still remains largely dependent on India. And as superpower and regional power relations worsen, Nepal's hedging strategy will be even less viable. And Nepal may be forced to pick a side because eventually, as I mentioned earlier, alignment becomes increasingly zero-sum in regional environments such as this, and Nepal may have to do it, Nepal be forced to pick a side without sort of having the upper hand, so to speak. Yeah, that is it.
So thank you, Ronak, for really bringing out the central paradox, as I see, which stands at the heart of Nepalese politics. That is that even as you helped us understand, even as uncertainties increase the need for for hedging,
Yes.
ironically, the space for it also shrinks the space for
Yes.
hedging. So some of that, you can see the dilemma and the kind of contradiction, and as Professor Lokraj Baral said, I think it is very, it's well taken about why Nepalese politics is, as he mentions, full of quote unquote, full of absurdities. So some of that, you brought out these contradictions so well. Thank you so much. I just quick question before I open the floor
Yeah.
for Q&A. You mentioned, the Chinese role, and I was thinking against the backdrop of what you mentioned about the heavy-handed tactics used by both, the countries. We also saw a few months ago a very extraordinary displays of public displeasure by the Chinese ambassador to Nepal, Chen. So
Was this on Twitter? Is this the?
yeah. So there have been, this is all over the press, and there were like public sparring with senior Nepalese journalists, and this is like, as I said, extraordinary because it's, he was on, also on Twitter.
Yeah.
That's right. So and it also one could see there was a lot of displeasure, but the fact that he chose to air it publicly, and to the manner in which he went about it, and
It was, I believe it was, I think.
The accident at that there's a relief and rescue in particular, which actually created a lot of
There was another incident similar to this as well. It was a journalist who quoted the interest rate for the loans for one of the airports.
Yes, I was just
That was-
going to say that.
That was
So when you
Gazendra
mentioned
Burakaki,
the
yeah.
aid-assisted funding.
Yes.
The senior journalist actually questioned that the Chinese interest rate is a lot higher than what is on paper.
Yeah.
And he actually was very, very, he went ballistic, and it was very, very quite unpleasant. And he demanded so it created a lot of, so the long story short, I was curious, I wanted to understand that we know the immediate triggers, the fact that China sees the Nepal signing the MCC as a loss of face, especially because they've publicly campaigned against it, and so on and so forth. But I was thinking, coming back to your core argument about what sort of a double-edged sword hedging becomes as a strategy itself. It shows that even when it is hedging presumably against India and trying to kind of hedge its bets, the Chinese reaction in this particular case also is a very sobering reminder of how difficult those, it could actually open new vulnerabilities for Nepal.
Yeah.
So that's just a thought and just a comment. You don't really need to. So should we just open the floor for questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your fascinating and detailed explanation. I have two questions, one from your talk.
Yeah.
Is the which you mentioned. You said that China is supporting Nepal's political parties directly.
Yeah.
By right transfer, I suppose.
Yes.
You have no legal framework that means anybody can send money to Nepal's political parties.
I think, I'm not exactly sure about this. I think it was done on the backdrop of sort of a disaster relief. I think they used that as a sort of way to sort of,
For all parties.
for all parties. So it wasn't just the communist parties. It was also Nepali Congress that they gave it to as well, which obviously, as I mentioned earlier, is seen as a more pro-Indian party. So it was to, I would say, the major parties rather than all parties. So yeah.
The second is since both the economies are so intertwined.
Yes.
What was the real or perceived impact of our demonetization? In 2017, we did
Sorry.
demonetization in India, remember?
No.
Was it 2017? 2017.
Okay.
Yeah, Bipin, could you please introduce yourself?
All right, okay. Hello, Ronak, this is Vipin. I'm also from Nepal. Thank you so much for interesting presentation. I work here in New Delhi, in one of the political think tank here. Some of the questions and a couple of comments, one or two comments. One, the sustainability of the hedging.
Yeah.
I mean, as you rightly mentioned that, I mean, hedging is very difficult aspect, and then Professor Kutin mentioned that it's a double-edged sword, yeah. But if you see the history of Nepal, right, I mean, it has always been like this, right?
Yeah.
It has always been, you can see since the time of early modern period, like during after Prithviraj Shah, and after that, we're always doing that thing.
Yeah.
Only thing is we're not giving it a name.
Yeah.
Now it's called like hedging. And earlier they used to call it a balancing in different ways.
Yes.
Right? Juggling the different opportunities and all this thing. So it has always been the case. So I don't know, the sustainability, I think it will remain some more time. I mean, I don't think it will go that easily first. Because if you see the dynamics of the internal political parties and the number of political parties in the parliament, as well as the geographical location of the country, where like more than 30 constituency or more than that, which is very closely aligned, very closely connected to the Indian border. They always support the policies that to have a better relations, economic as well as political relations with India. Same case with the other 15 or 17, 15 or 14 districts that's closely connected to the China, right? And they also try to support like better economic opportunities, better trade routes, and better political relations with China.
Yeah.
And all this has a representation in the center.
Yeah.
So I mean, we have I don't know, it's out of good way or like in bad way, and this is how we are. This is how we are situated. We cannot change the thing. So hedging as a political strategy, I think it's gonna take some more time to go. And then even though it's difficult, we always live in difficulty. I mean, as a strategy, geopolitical strategy, Nepal has always remained in this kind of difficulty since long time. So I think even though there is some hesitation, like whether to go this one or that one, I think this is the status quo. This is how it goes. I mean, this is not we are not in age of anything. We are like, this is how we are. We are always like this. This is one of my observations. Another thing is the question of the sustainability and the, let's say, the return of investment on the projects.
Yeah.
Like a couple of projects are funded by China and sometimes India. As a student of international relations, myself, as you are, I think sometimes state does investment where it not necessarily has to have a return of investment, right? Because of many reasons. You just mentioned a couple of reasons about 2015, 1989, and other regions. Sometimes it is strategically important for any states to invest in a projects which short run may not give any returns, right?
Yep.
So you can just take an example of Indian Railways. It's like in loss now. I mean, but it has to have that thing to continue to maintain it for connectivity and other issues. Same case with Nepal, I think. And interestingly, I found it interesting in your argument. Thing is about very closely connected to the Southeast Asian countries are doing, as also argued by the Professor Mabu from Singapore, who also talks about the limitation of the Western international relations theories, or maybe the approaches about dealing with dealing with a big power, how the state tries to do. I think this is interesting. How Nepal is also trying to do that came up in your argument, which is interesting to hear. Regarding, I think sometime I also think sometime when you see like down the line, like our strategic history and economic history, I mean, categorizing China as a threat, I don't know how, I mean, is it too much empirically evident in Nepal, or is it like we are also influenced by the grand meta narrative that is being circulating all around? So, I mean, look the history of China since long time. I mean, like, for me, there is no direct threat that is being posed to Nepal. I mean, even though people consider as 1950 when the Tibet was incorporated or whatever invaded by China, there is circulation that okay, it's a threat and all, but like still, I mean, you know, I know, and
Yeah.
then in Nepal there was not measured as a threat, and in the 10 years down the line, we agreed for the peacefully border relationship. So I don't know. Maybe you could tell us a little bit
Yes.
more about it.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah.
Would you like to answer?
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. What you said is true. Throughout history, since Prithviraj Shah, we've always wanted to balance our relationship with both countries. But we do have to understand the world of then and the world of now is very, very different. Nepal has always said that it's neutral and it wants to balance the relationship with both countries. But I think in Nepal, we don't look at this critically enough. Let's just say, for one instance, in 1962, in the Sino-Indian War, Nepal took and it was, neutral. But at the same time, there were Nepali Gorkhas fighting in the Indian army. Could we really say that we were neutral in this war when our own people from our own ethnic background were fighting against China? I think in Nepal, we don't look at this critically enough. And I do agree that we do need to balance, and realistically throughout history, we wanted to balance to protect our own sovereignty. That was one of the main reasons. But could we not say that because these countries are now wanting to sort of ensure alignment by doing things such as putting parties together, is that not a way that our sovereignty is also eroded? So I think here we have to argue what kind of at the end of the day, because of our vulnerabilities, we are very much reliant upon our neighbors, and there's not much we can do about it. But I think there are ways that we can sort of try and have the upper hand in these things rather than sort of being a reactive force as we are at the moment, where we're sort of trying to play these countries against each other. And now we've given a lot of ground to both countries. Before, China was a very reactive force in Nepal. We used to invite them in. Now China is a very active force in Nepal where they have interests maintained within the country, and therefore it sort of raises the stakes for them. So I wouldn't necessarily say China is a threat. I never mentioned that China was a threat, but I do believe that because now there's a lot of Chinese investment in Nepal through the BRI, through the fact that, through the BRI, through hydroelectricity, because there was a lot of project funding as well. Because now we've invited Chinese influence in the region, I just feel like where in the past we used to invite Chinese influence to sort of curb Indian influence, but now we have both of these influences competing against each other. And could we not argue that our sovereignty has been eroded even more now that we have two countries competing there? So I think it's more important to look at it a bit critically as opposed to just always trying to maintain a balance and maintain neutrality, because things change. Prithviraj Shah was 250 years ago. Even Mahendra was almost 80 years ago, but we're still sort of repeating the same maxims that we did about balancing and stuff, even though things have changed completely in those years.
Be the yam between the.
Be the yam between the two borders. Yeah, I feel like Nepal's, at least foreign policy, is based on a lot of rhetoric and not as much pragmatism as it should be. As we mentioned, Vietnam, we still carry this historical baggage about India influencing our country, when Vietnam and America used to go to war with each other, but now they're seeking closer relations because this is what makes sense at the moment. And Nepal doesn't do that. Nepal still looks at historical baggage and still tries to sort of formulate its foreign policy according to this. So yeah, that's my comment on that.
Oh, thank you. So there are several questions online.
Yep.
How would you like to do this? So should I read a few, or would you like to take?
I think one by one is
by
probably good. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is, could you elaborate on how Nepal might measure the effectiveness of its hedging strategy in the short and long term, given the challenges in trade, diplomacy, and geopolitical tensions?
Yep. So I think the best thing to do this is the way I did it is sort of seeing how, like I said, 10 years I would say is pretty short term in terms of strategy. So I'd say one of the ways that I did it was hypothetically speaking, if this sort of blockade were to happen now, has Nepal actually got, you know, enough domestic resources, enough domestic market to actually function as a sovereign country? And if we used to use that categorization, I would argue that it is not capable of doing so. And I would say probably the most important thing is to improve our own domestic standing and not so much rely on other countries. We used to have some sort of a manufacturing base in the past. We don't anymore. Even even agriculturally, we import a lot of things now. I believe these are things that we could improve, so we're not as reliant upon neighbors for these things. So, yeah.
So there's a question from Dr. Geeta Kocher from JNU.
Yep.
And she's teaches in JNU. She's asked, how do you see China's interests of Tibetans in Nepal, and how will the current regime manage the balance between China's interests and anti-China Western forces' interests in Nepal?
I think Nepal's stances towards Tibetan refugees has always been in line with China's. They follow the one China policy, of course, not exactly related to this, but even recently, Nepal didn't allow Tibetan refugees to celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday, and Nepal has been very consistent with Chinese interest in this. I think even recently, when I believe the American coordinator for Tibetan refugees visited Tibetan refugees without the government permission, Chinese officials were concerned about this, and Nepal supported this because this was done without Nepalese government permission. So I think Nepal very much aligns with China in view of Tibetan refugees, and I think it wasn't until long ago that they didn't even offer Tibetan refugee citizenship and sort of crack down on them as per China's wishes, as opposed to any sort of conforming Western stances on Tibetan refugees.
Thank you, Rana. So the next question is, what, according to you, should be the way forward which Nepal should adopt? Stick your neck out.
I had a feeling that this would come up. I think, again, we have to be a bit pragmatic. Considering the position we are now, I would probably say a stronger alignment with India is probably favorable at the moment. Because let's just look at hydroelectricity, for example, right? It is one of the areas where Nepal actually has the ability to export it to different areas, including India. India has been very helpful, at least to even import it, as a transit country to export electricity to Bangladesh. And now if India starts saying that we're not going to buy any hydroelectricity that has Chinese influence in it, we're not going to sell that electricity to China. We have to sell it to India, who need that energy, and Bangladesh, who need that energy. So I feel like, well, that is one of the reasons why I think our stronger alignment with India for the moment, again, we have to assess it pragmatically. It probably makes sense for us as opposed to a relationship with China. And also, I mentioned earlier, it is very logistically challenging to actually maintain strong trade relations with China because we have two very fraught roads that link Nepal and China together. It's very difficult to trade through that. So it is just not logistically possible, which is why, just because of geography, we have so many more cultural and social linkages with India as with China in the first place. We can't just, build something through the mountains and hope.
Would you like to throw in the Pokhara? The reason why it did not take off is also because I believe India refused to give overflight.
Because it has Chinese, it was Pokhara and Bhairava both were built through Chinese loans, but this is a bit more, it's not exactly accepted, so I didn't want to mention it, but it could, yeah, they've been very vocal about the hydroelectricity stuff, that they're not going to buy hydroelectricity from things with Chinese investment, but they haven't mentioned it specifically about the airports, which is why I didn't want to mention something that is not official. But we can ascertain that it could be a reason why India is not flying any flights to Pokhara at the moment as well.
Just one long comment, bear with me, please. Instead of quote unquote hedging, can we look at a countervailing strategy being followed by Nepal vis-a-vis India by seeking a closer engagement with China as a diplomatic tool? Historically, that has helped in getting India's attention, but now China seeks dominance rather than only influence at a strategic periphery, including Nepal. In this changed context, the traditional strategic strategy of playing off China against India seems to be yielding suboptimal outcomes for Nepal, as China is more demanding and India less inclined to compete for Nepal's affection with a project per project approach. Your comments.
This is what I mentioned earlier about how China used to be almost reactive and wait for Nepalese invitation to come to Nepal. But now, because China's gained such a strong foothold, completely agree with this comment. It's raised the stakes for China because they've committed so many resources. And as you mentioned, yeah, India is a lot more reluctant because historically what Nepal will do is if they find something if they want to curb Indian influence, they'll look towards China. So during King Birendra's time, he would, whenever he wanted concessions from India, he would appoint Tulsi Giri as prime minister, who would stoke anti-Indian elements in Nepal to try and get concessions out of India. And then, this is particularly with the, I think the 1979 rewiring of the Trade and Transit Treaty. Then India eventually succumbed and gave a trade and transit treaty, which is what Nepal wanted, 2 different treaties. And then what Birendra did was just put a pro-Indian prime minister in power. So they've done this historically. And I think India just know that this is the card that Nepal plays and they're not very much interested in this. So I definitely agree with what they've had to say.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah.
So, would you consider hedging against India and China as a viable strategy for Nepal, or is it, or why isn't there a role for US? Because US is the great power and it's also the regional power.
Yeah.
And according to IR theory expectation, you would expect Nepal to hedge against US, which has
Yeah.
historically been the case when China was not a very rising power back then, like let's say pre 2000. So that one, and also the internal political, debates which are happening based on foreign policy issues. So would you consider a more bipartisan consensus on foreign policy issues among the bigger parties in Nepal due to a lot of all these foreign policy issues happening, let's say India's investment and BRI's investment?
Yeah. So within the first question is you're asking why Nepal's not hedging again with the USA.
Yeah, larger power.
I think one, because again, we talk about logistically, Nepal is in a very hard position for USA to engage constantly with, right? Even USA wants India to be the regional leader through its Indo-Pacific strategy. The White House paper for Indo-Pacific strategy doesn't even mention Nepal. It mentions India as the regional leader through which India will sort of play a major role in the region. And also, USA has tried to play a bigger influence in the region, but even that has become very politicized, as we've seen with the MCC. Even that has become very politicized because of China. And I would say even there was a lot of misinformation being spread within Nepal about MCC and other US initiatives. So we had one where the American National Guard were meant to come and help us with disaster relief and stuff, but we had to cancel it because people thought, oh, we were going to have American troops on the ground, and there was a lot of misinformation spread about it. So I think USA has just become too politicized as an actor in Nepal, and whereas India, although it is politicized, it's just by geography, it has the ability to influence Nepal, whereas the USA, it's as large of a power it is quite difficult to combat combat India and China for influence in Nepal. And sorry, could you repeat the second question again?
I said is foreign policy issues, I mean, are those issues influencing bipartisan consensus in Nepal?
That's again difficult to say just because of the nature of Nepali politics. It's very, they're very opportunistic. I don't even think that they think of things at that level, if I'm being completely honest. A lot of it is just about regime survival. Most foreign policy issues are about regime survival. As I mentioned, even the BRI, something that ideologically Sherbrother Deva would be against, he's fine with it now because he realizes that this might be beneficial for his survival, his regime survival. So, which is why he has one of the projects is going to be within his hometown. So it's because of this, I think it's quite difficult to answer that question completely.
No. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am Usually I work at CPR. So I had a small question because that's partly a doubt you can say that
Yeah.
you mentioned about like actually you mentioned a couple of times about the hydropower component that
Yes.
India has sort of said no to wherever the Chinese
Yeah.
investments are there. But I mean, if you look at the Indo-Nepal relation, there is already a substantial number of hydropower projects
Yeah.
that are being undergoing, like
Yeah.
Mahakali, from a very
Yes.
long period
Yes.
like in history. So why do you think, I mean, is this the case? Is it because Nepal already has a very high significant hydropower potential, they want to engage Chinese to sort of exploit that, and that's because of a contention with India, because or sort of Nepal is not adequately engaging with India for sort of development of hydropower. I mean, why do you think this dynamics has sort of evolved? Because there's a long history of hydropower
Yes.
cooperation between the two countries.
I think historically, again, you mentioned the Mahakali Treaty. I think Indian involvement in hydroelectricity in Nepal has been very controversial. And Nepal, a lot of even the Maoists, as I mentioned earlier, when they were in thing, they accused the government of selling our water resources to Nepal. Even now, there's a lot of controversy around this, saying that India buys up the water, India blockades the dams and sort of floods Nepal. So I think that's why historically Indian involvement in hydroelectricity in Nepal is seen as a negative influence, whereas China is sort of like this sort of savior that will come and invest in hydroelectricity. So I think because of the politicization of India's influence in hydroelectricity, it has made very difficult for India to engage in hydroelectricity. But I think even now, India is still buying hydroelectricity in Nepal and helping sort of send it to Bangladesh as well, getting a third country involved. And I think this is very beneficial because now you've introduced a third country, which sort of helps Nepal, because I mentioned Nepal's whole thing is it is scared of his sort of is scared of his dependency on India. But now if you add Bangladesh, there's another party. So India is sort of trying to improve its reputation from previous years because it understands that Nepal wants more regional powers involved, more regional players involved. So I think India is taking good steps in this, but I think doing things such as not buying hydropower from that sort of hurts their image as it did in the past of just their engagement in the hydropower sector. I think that sort of might hurt their image in the longer run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sir, I've traveled a lot in Nepal several times, and I have a grassroots study
Yeah.
of the people and the situation. Now, you have said this hedging, and lastly, you said Nepal will be forced to pick the side.
Yes.
That's your word.
Yeah.
One hand hedging, another pick the side.
Yeah.
Sir, both this question doesn't arise. I am a student of comparative study and evolution of histories. As a student of history, I can tell you one thing. Monarchy gone, with monarchy gone and Nepal no longer a Hindu state. Now next, a fast changing Nepali demography, particularly in south and east. You know it. In the south it is changing and foreign powers are already interfering. That the same in the east. The situation is not going to remain to be the same, right, in the future. Now what I have to say as a student of history, the question that India and Nepal have nothing to lose. Whether it goes that way, whether it goes to America, whether it goes to China, you can't avoid China. China has got a border in the north and we are in the south, right? So there's no question. But we are not going to Nepal, mind you, they take it from me. Nepal and China has nothing to lose what happened to hedging and what happens to taking sides. Nepal has already taken side. Historically speaking, they have already taken side. This is temporary shifting. No, it's stepping over there, stepping over here. So nothing to worry about it. Both will benefit. Let them go wherever they want to go. Thank you.
So we have any other questions? Yes. No, I know a couple of more questions are there on Zoom. So Ronak, there's a question about how do you visualize recruitment of Nepalese Gurkhas in the Indian Army in the near future?
I think recently there was the whole scandal with Nepalese army being recruited with the Agnipath scheme, wasn't there? Well, I won't lie, I'm not very a big expert on military diplomacy, so I can't really answer this question effectively. So if it's okay, we can skip this one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's another a longish comment and a question. Please bear with me. So the question goes, actually, Nepal's stance on Tibetan refugees has undergone a fundamental shift with its position becoming much more closely aligned to China's demands, which you've already explained to us, including in terms of transboundary security operations by China. Earlier, Nepal facilitated flow of Tibetan refugees through its territory to India in sizable numbers. That transit flow of Tibetan refugees to India has come to virtually zero. Why China's overt pressure tactics on this and many other issues like interference in the country's domestic politics gets very little attention in Nepal?
I think this is mainly because a lot of Tibetan refugees, they actually exist in sort of a limbo. A lot of them are trying to, a lot of them don't have citizenship papers, and therefore it is very hard for them to actually lobby the government in doing anything effective. And again, as I mentioned earlier, anything that will come through this, Nepal sort of sees this as being anti-China. It doesn't want any anti-China activities within the country. And I believe because of this, it has dissuaded a lot of Tibetan refugees from even any political movements and such, and they're more sort of concerned about heading towards India to do any of these things. I think, sadly, sort of Tibetan refugees in Nepal who have existed there for quite some time, who might have been there for multiple generations, are dissuaded from doing anything in Nepal because they realize that Nepal's stance is very strong. They don't want, because China sees this as anti-China activities, Nepal would not permit any, like the fact that something as benevolent as celebrating the Dalai Lama's birthday party is seen as, you know, a sort of controversial thing. Nepal would never allow it, any sort of protests against, let's say, China, or like sort of fighting for their rights as refugees in Nepal. Nepal would instantly see it as anti-China, wouldn't allow it to happen. And a lot of them, they don't really have political representation as well. It has never sort of appealed to political parties to try and sort of appeal to them. So because of this, sadly, they're very powerless in terms of sort of gaining any rights for them.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
I wonder if
Could we
yes.
please hang out the
thank you. Vadim Ramadan of Russian Embassy. Well, thank you, Ronak, for your excellent presentation. My question was about the connectivity between Nepal and China. As I understand, and we've seen on one of the slides, that the connectivity is relatively poor,
Yes.
at least compared to the one between Nepal and India. So I was wondering if that the consequence of a relatively small amount of trade between Nepal and China. It's one of the reasons for the fact that trade is relatively underdeveloped. Thank you.
So sorry, could you rephrase that question? It's because I didn't exactly get the question.
Yeah, right. So I was wondering, the trade is pretty small between
Yes.
Nepal and China, and connectivity is poor.
Yeah.
So what's the reason for the fact that that happens? Because there are no good ways of connection
Yes.
for moving the trade,
Yeah.
or because there is no interest in developing the infrastructure to encourage the trade.
I think so. One of them is obviously the poor connectivity, and it's actually cheaper to send stuff from mainland China through Kolkata than actually coming through Tibet into Nepal. It works out cheaper. That's why a lot of Chinese trade comes through through Kolkata from Nepal, from the southern border as opposed from the northern border. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it is very hard to. So that's just for imports. For exports from Nepal, stuff going towards China, we can't just compete with their products at all. And in fact, the only things that are imported from, because I spent quite a lot of time in the Roswa area. So the Tatabani border we only have two border points with China. One is the Tatabani border that was closed for quite significant time after the earthquake. Then you have the Roswagadi border where I spent some time. And the only thing when I was there that was coming through were apples. That was about the only thing that was being imported at that time. I believe this was around 20. There would be truckloads of apples and some, cheap clothes. But apart from that, nothing was coming through that border. There was no oil, nothing of the sort. And I think because a lot of things are just cheaper for it to come through Kolkata and other Indian ports than it is coming through there. Just because I mentioned earlier, it is just very, very poorly connected and very dependent upon the seasons as well. Like I mentioned, during monsoon, there will be a lot of landslides, a lot of floodings and things like this that stop the trade from coming through. So yeah.
Any more questions? Partha, please. Can I get your mic, Partha?
Thank you. Yeah, we're online. So, one, could you tell us a little bit more about how Nepal is looking at the other countries in just partly in South Asia, but also now in West Asia, because you're seeing a lot more emigration from Nepal to those countries, right? So in terms of the other diversification, there used to be a lot of work with India.
Yeah.
But now you're seeing a much more wider migration story.
Yeah.
So where does that factor into that structure? And secondly, beyond the Nepal, India, China troika, what's the story with Bhutan, Bangladesh, even Myanmar for that matter, but also Sri Lanka and structures in case they request India for third-party access, and electricity is one major issue which some of that has already taken place. Do you see that as a possible issue that might come up as where you basically have an isolated India given the kind of structures that we are going through?
So I think the first is a very good point. Nepal has seen a lot of immigration to West Asia, particularly in the Middle East, through migrant workers. I think this is something that will play out I think this is a development, obviously very recent, and I think its influence is going to play out in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. Because one of the main reasons is that the migrant workers that actually go to these countries, although they have the right to vote, they do not have any mechanism to vote in the country. So sadly, a lot of their concerns, a lot of their interests are not reflected, sadly, within Nepal, within the government, and also a lot of government officials, politicians, they have manpower companies that actually send these labor migrants aboard these countries, and a lot of them don't have any interest in actually bringing any positive changes to, let's say, migrant workers in West Asia. So this is actually a work I've done about trying to get some sort of voting rights, some sort of voting mechanisms for migrant workers. I did this during just after COVID, and sadly, there just hasn't been any progress on it. So the Supreme Court has said that there should be a mechanism for migrant workers to vote, especially those in West Asia, but there just isn't a mechanism. And recently, we have a sort of new emerging leader, Ravi Lamitane, who actually used a lot of, he was very popular amongst migrant workers, and a lot of them came back during the election cycle to actually vote for him, and he won with a massive majority. So I feel like this might be something that will play out in the future, but sadly, I don't think there's much that Nepal is doing in terms of the migration that have gone to West Asia. And so could you repeat your second question again, if that's okay?
What extent do you think that Nepal could build links with other South Asian nations?
Yeah.
Because India is currently in a relatively fraught neighborhood. So, yes, we have issues with China, but if all the other neighbors then essentially transfer electricity, for example, sales to third countries,
Yes.
Even for that matter, Pakistan,
Yes.
to what extent would that be something that we would be hard pressed to deny?
I think that is a very good idea. I think Nepal should seek to build partnership with other regional countries. I think again, as I mentioned with Bangladesh, that is something obviously because of the land border is something India needs to facilitate, but Nepal should independently be building a relationship with Bhutan, building a relationship with Pakistan, building a relationship with Sri Lanka. But I think doing so might sort of raise concerns in Delhi because historically they've seen other regional powers sort of building relationship as them balancing against India. So I think there is a need to sort of be in constant, dialogue with India about this as well. And I think it's best done through multilateral institutions such as BIMSTEC and maybe SAARC, as opposed to maybe bilateral meetings. So I think multilateralism and then using multilateral forums to sort of build links is probably the best idea here because I think again. India already has fears of China sort of encircling them, and I think they might see these countries that are potentially hostile to India as sort of balancing against them and sort of going against their interests. So I think it would be important to get India involved in these dialogues as well.
The PBI would be one.
Yeah, I think BIMSTEC as well would be very important in this.
More questions? You're done? Okay. So I think should we just wrap up? Thank you once again, Ronak, for taking time out and also for accommodating my request to come and speak with us, even though you came here to Delhi for a brief personal visit. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the audience, both gathered here at CPR and also on Zoom. It's been both a privilege and a pleasure to have continued this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.